evening.
No problem.
Hope you enjoyed the cocktail. I thought it was quite good. Lovely to see you all there. We have an action-packed day, so I'm really impressed that you're all here, nice and early. We've got 2 panels, 2 breakaway sessions, and a gallery walk exhibition this afternoon. So we've got a lot to get to. I think it's going to be a really exciting day. We are starting with our panel on the media and social accountability. And this is something that's quite close to my heart. And I'm very pleased to have a panel of people that include journalists and trainers and activists and who are going to help us to grapple with some of the issues around the role of the media in social accountability. So very briefly, let me introduce from the far left, Karabo Rajuli, who's the advocacy coordinator at Amabungani, which is an investigative journalism center. If you haven't seen their website or read any of their work, I would strongly suggest you do. They do incredible investigative journalism work in South Africa. Yeah. We then have Mr. Jimmy Maliseni, who's the Information and Advocacy Officer at the Alliance for Community Action in Zambia. And they do incredible work with citizen journalists in their context, really exciting, looking at different ways of drawing in citizens in that type of work. And I then have on closest to me, Ms. Faiza Abrams-Smith, who is the Executive Director of the Institute for the Advancement of Journalism here in South Africa, which is a training institute and does really interesting work trying to capacitate journalists and think about what's needed for journalists in today's very tumultuous kind of ever-changing world. So very welcome to all of you. We really appreciate you being here. And I think that it's fitting that we have a panel on the media and journalism in social accountability today, especially as we commemorate the death of Steve Biko on this day in 1977. As an activist and a writer, I think it's fitting that we also think about, in today's world, where journalists are still being intimidated and threatened and killed in some instances for the work that they do, that we are able to talk about these kinds of issues and how the social accountability sector can draw in support and work with journalists and the media to hold decision makers and duty bearers to account. And so I want to just start this panel with a short excerpt from, she's a media studies academic called Katrin Boltmer. And I read her work and it makes me think a lot about the kind of things that we need to think about in terms of journalism and the media and social accountability. So she says, because the media are the main source of information and a vital link between the government and citizens, the presence of the media is an indispensable precondition for both government accountability and social accountability. Without reliable information, citizens would not be able to use their power effectively at election time, nor would they be aware of the problems and issues that need active consideration beyond voting. The daily flows of news generates a running tally of government policies, political events, and the actions of political officials on the basis of which citizens make their choices. The media are also expected to provide a forum where a broad range of voices, opposition parties, civil society actors, independent experts, and ordinary citizens can express their alternative views. Moreover, the media are widely seen as the fourth estate, referring to the media as an institution alongside other branches of government, which together provide a system of checks and balances to control political officials and prevent misuses of power. And I think that for me, in a sense, is quite inspiring, but I think it also raises a lot of questions for me about what we expect from the media as civil society, as citizens, as social accountability practitioners. And so I wanted to start the panel with a broad question to all of the panelists, to ask them whether we are expecting too much of the media in that sense, in being able to play that role of the fourth estate, particularly in the climate today where, you know, journalists, even in South Africa, are receiving threats from government officials or from powerful people, in a climate of social media, you know, where people are spreading fake news. Can we still expect that role for the media today?
I think that question is extremely relevant. I think citizens need to ask far more questions, far more probing questions, more today than ever before. Because if citizens don't ask those questions, who holds the media accountable? But who also then pushes the boundaries? I would like to believe that there's a lot of information available. We have access to a lot of information, but we need to ask ourselves, how relevant is that information, and does it make an impact on my life? Does it change my environment? Because on the one extreme, I know South Africa, for example, the landscape has changed tremendously over the last couple of years. We're talking about transforming the media. At the same time, the impact on social media is growing. We need to look at where if there are media ethics, for example, when it comes to social media platforms. Does citizens understand the responsibility of utilizing that media? Do they understand the dangers at times of that media? I'll just give you a small example. I think a week ago in South Africa, AfroViews, there were 5 contenders shortlisted for that television channel. So the group that got it is News with a Z, Room group that got it. Immediately on a WhatsApp social group, a political group, people start identifying who the individuals were in this that got it, even though there was a clear process. Afro News knew they were going off that channel, and they knew there were 7 coming in, and there were 5 that were shortlisted, and then 1 eventually got awarded. And they started saying, for example, Zanele Mtembu is Jackson Mtembu's wife. This person is linked to that person. And this went on, and now it is on social media. Someone writes something, and all the faceless people comes in with opinions of their own, without checking. We just go hysterical. 2 days later, the fool who put out the false news had to say, oh, my apologies. It's not Zanele Mtembu, it's Tembi Mtembu, and she's not the wife of. The point is, very few people would then see that apology, because everyone would be hyped up on the first thing that we saw. And we never go back to verify sources for ourselves. You know, and we just spread it and spread it and spread it. That's just one incident. Another incident over the weekend, there was some party in Durban, someone's celebration. So obviously Zuma was there, Ismachashula, you know, the certain group of people were there. The journalist then covered it, wrote about it. The deputy secretary of the ANC Women's League then attacks this woman journalist, Hunter, and sends her a WhatsApp of a gun. You know, just sends a picture of a gun. So again, what do we do as citizens? How do we hold these individuals accountable? Because it's almost like we just observers and the party's playing out there on our behalf.
Okay, thank you very much for that great contribution. I'll begin by referencing myself to what the conversation I had with Vanessa yesterday, which is that we are beginning, as Africa generally and the sub-region in particular, we are beginning to look more and more the same in terms of the shrinking space as far as independent media practicing is concerned. So even in countries where there was a lot of space and room for journalists to work independently, those spaces no longer exist. But at the same time, there's also an increase of sources of information away from the traditional media. So when we say that the media is the fourth estate, we need to, first of all, define which part of the media should constitute that fourth estate. And after we do that, we need then to begin and define or find ways of how to make that media relevant in everyday lives of the people, but also to make that media more prominent over what is generally, to use Trump's term, fake news or malicious blogs, or whatever term we might give to those other non-credible news sources. So the challenge that we sit with, in my opinion, at the moment, in as far as making the media effective in being the gatekeepers of society, being the watchdog actors over power holders, is to first of all identify this media and separate the sheep from the wolves, depending on which ones we want. If we want the sheep, let's identify our sheep and know that this is our sheep and go with it. If we want the lions, let's identify them as such. As long as we remain in a space where we have media that has gone rogue, and a media that is malicious, media that is serving private interests of political people or business people, then we are going to have this problem for a very, very long time. And we must not make the mistake of believing that all blogs that are non-ethical out there, or media practitioners that are not doing the right work, are not professionals. That is not the truth. Because in our situation as Zambia, we've got some of the most unprofessional media work being done by some of the most qualified journalists. The issue is that they have been co-opted to serve a particular interest. So how do you then separate those from the groups that are still doing proper work? And I'm glad we have Karabo here from an investigative journalism organization, because increasingly what I've observed is that a lot of malicious work in the media, a lot of bad work, as we've just heard now, is coming out under the guise of investigative journalism. So that the public is being made to believe that these stories are actually true, except our sources, they are whistleblowers, we cannot expose them. If we do, they are going to be killed. Well, those stories are very difficult to coordinate or collaborate. So at the end of the day, they are gaining traction in the general public. People are believing them. Those blogs are growing, their following is growing. In fact, in Zambia, they have some of the biggest organic growth on social media. So they don't even need to go to Facebook and pay for promotions, for instance, to promote their pages. But just the nature of the stories they put out in itself makes everybody know about their existence, and they begin to follow them. So I think that is where I'll begin, Vanessa, by saying, if we are going to say we want the media to be effective in upholding democracy, in ensuring that the civic space does not shrink, the media space does not shrink, we must begin by defining which media are we talking about.
Thank you.
Sure. So yesterday when Professor Tulima Donsela was speaking about democracy and democracy under strain, for me it echoed with what's happening in the media space, and I'll talk about South Africa because that's what I'm familiar with, and media in South Africa too being under strain. And I think that's part of media feeling the pressure of a democracy which is under strain. And it's from a variety of places. I think the big thing is that the old model of media, the commercial model, is no longer working with the rise in social media, alternative news sources, and so the traditional model was print is pretty much sustained through advertising, and that is pretty much, it's almost a broken model as it stands right now. And so there's huge amounts of pressure on traditional commercial media, where newsrooms are shrinking very quickly, journalists' jobs are constantly under risk. I'm hugely encouraged, I think, just by the courage of journalists who do still work in commercial media, who are working under very difficult circumstances. So Vanessa, to your question, should we be expecting more of media? I think we should. I think in the quotation that you gave, you spoke about media being an institution. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that term. I prefer to see media, at least independent media, sort of standing outside of any formal political institution and rather talking about media as a public good. That citizens, people need information to be able to make choices, to be able to make political choices, to be able to make social choices, and that comes from having reliable information, and media, particularly independent media, plays a crucial role in that. When, I suppose, a question of expectation, I liked what you raised around the story about multi-choice and the selection of the particular news channel. That case speaks to, I think, the level of accountability media should have to the people, to the public who consume that content. And I think in that process, what was lacking quite significantly on the part of multi-choice was transparency around why those particular choices were made, why that final news channel was the one that is selected. And as much as I think it's good to have news sources of media, I think having media diversity is hugely important. It's not good to only have a few sources of information for the public. It is also very problematic when the choice around which media are given priority and visibility in society are not spoken about transparently. Just, I suppose the last point I want to make is we are living in a time of mistrust, and I think just having transparency is important. But ultimately, when he spoke about today being the 41st anniversary of the death of Steve Biko, the quotation that he had was that the most powerful weapon in the minds of the oppressed is their minds. And I think the role of media becomes opportunity for people to be able to have a narrative which is given to them by those in power, be it our political leaders or our business leaders, challenged. And so ultimately we should be demanding more of media, we should be wanting more transparent and accountable media. Yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to necessarily engage in a dialogue about what you said, but I think that's important. You raised some important points.
So I'll come back to the point that you made, in a sense, Jimmy, and ask you specifically, we also spoke about this yesterday, is how do we move beyond the media just being a space where it's just a messenger? How do we bring it into our space as social accountability practitioners and have it move beyond it just being a platform for us to showcase what we're doing? So how do we bring them into the conversation?
Thank you, Vanessa. The short answer to that is build their capacity to understand what social accountability is. Okay. To elaborate further on that, having worked on both sides of this divide, although it's not so much of a divide, coming from a media background as a practitioner myself in the media in Zambia, I think that social accountability actors have a lot of work to do in terms of making the media understand what social accountability is as an institution, and get to a point where they become part of our daily conversations, in meetings, in trainings, in all the spaces that the social accountability communities are meeting. So when we do that, the idea, in my opinion, should be not to co-opt the media to become part of the social accountability army. Because if you do that, you are then going to create a group or as a part of the media that is going to be a part of the social accountability community. Mm-hmm. And they are essentially just going to transform themselves from being media actors to become social accountability actors. What we want as social accountability actors or as a community is a media that first of all understands our work, but is still able to work independently away from the social accountability community. The same way we have, for instance, journalists that are working in banking as a specialty, in economics. They don't necessarily become economists, but they are able to interrogate economic processes. And so they can go and get employed as an economic journalist or as a a climate change journalist because they understand the intricacies of that particular subject, but they are still able to form independent and verified opinions. The challenge of co-opting them to become a part of us is that they will lose the same independence that we desire that they should have. And if they do that, then we as a community are going to be at a very big risk. The first risk that I foresee myself is that we are going to have a situation where the media has become part of the social accountability community, and therefore they've by default become a part of the demand side. So ideally, the media should sit in the middle and reflect to society the truth between what the demand side is saying and what the supply side is saying. And for them to do that effectively, they must have a good understanding of what is required from either side. Having them on one side or the other is not very beneficial. That concept for me would also work well for us when you consider the dynamics of the social accountability space. In the sense that time and again, I'll speak about Zambia because I understand the Zambian context very well. It is not unheard of in Zambia for a strong and vibrant civil society advocating for improved or enhanced service delivery today to completely change tomorrow and begin living in a completely different Zambia. So today they're speaking about this Zambia that needs improvement in so many areas. Tomorrow, the Zambia they live in is utopian. And so what you need is a media outfits that are able to say, what these guys have done is simply change their opinion. As far as we know, as far as we are concerned, as far as the facts are concerned, this status quo has not changed, or indeed it has changed. But if you have them on your side of the argument, then it means when you change, then they must change with you. So as a community then, we are going to find ourselves where the public gets misled because the media too can be co-opted, social accountability actors can be co-opted by politicians. And so if the media swings with one side or the other, then the public is lost and we've not done any great service. So for me, Vanessa, the first thing is to have the media understand our work, but they need to retain their independence. So yes, they must be the messenger, they must carry the message effectively, but they must carry it with very high levels of independence. And the only way we are going to do that is by bringing them on board, making them understand what our work entails, what the government should be doing, so that they must be able to then make comparisons between our work and what the government is doing. One of my trainers in Zambia is a gentleman called Edem Jokoto, and he put out a very brilliant piece yesterday. In Zambia we have, and I'm sure Wesley is part of that, we have a WhatsApp group, a very big WhatsApp group called Media and Sources, where the media and sources, ourselves, the information officers, the executive directors, so we put out statements, we record audios, and the media gets that information and publishes it as is. Some people even write in the third person. So I can write an article about my organization in the third person. Mr. Jimmy Madison said, he further added, and share it there, and the media will just pick it as I have shared it and broadcast it or publish it. So those are the dangerous spaces in which we can go. Now imagine if my statement was misleading. So those are the kind of dangerous areas into which we are going. So if you raise these kind of issues in those platforms, then they'll threaten you with a media blackout, so that they don't want the truth to be told, because the media has, in our context, simply become very lazy. So social accountability actors need to awaken the media if they must play their role of the fourth estate effectively. Let me end here for now.
Thanks, Jimmy. I think you raised some really interesting points that I think we see in a lot of our countries. So I'm going to ask Faiza, in terms of training, future journalists, how do we train them in a space where they are confronted with this kind of misinformation, having to very quickly produce information, breaking news, beat the competitors. But at the same time, you mentioned we are inundated with information, but is it relevant to citizens? Does it really touch me as a citizen? Does it affect my life? How do we train journalists to be, those kinds of actors in society that are able to delve into information, but then make it accessible and relevant to citizens?
Before I answer that, I think one of the challenges that we face within South Africa is that we've got 4 or 5 universities that offers journalism degrees. I think it's Rhodes, Wits, UJ, UKZN. Yeah. Now, the challenge that I find, having worked almost 30 years within this field at different levels, is that more and more students graduate. But very few of those graduates know what journalism is about. They have the theory. They've written the thesis. They've done well. But put them in the workplace. Put them through an interview. Give them 1 paragraph and tell them to write it in their own words. If you take 10 of them, 2 of them will write it correct. That's been my experience. Secondly, what you find too, the challenge that I have is I always say to myself, where does it need to change? Now in South Africa we know more and more it's clear our education system needs to change. It's outdated. It's teaching our kids irrelevant stuff. It doesn't prepare them for life. Now if you look at university graduates again, overall, we've spoken about this, we're talking about the 4th industrial revolution or the 4th industrial estate. There's very few graduates with the right skills to be moved into the 4th industrial estate. We've had this discussion, and I think with USASA, with the DTPS, and they've acknowledged that students and graduates don't have the right skills to move forward. So we have to really look at what we're equipping and skilling people with. Now when it comes to training institutions, we don't train journalists, we build continuous capacity. So we work with working journalists, we're working with people who's already graduated, and we build capacity and we hope to enhance existing knowledge. So for example, when we look at the social media source and platform, it's to encourage people to think about ethics, to think about what you put something into a public space, it's there even if you delete it on your computer or on your cell phone. Also how that can be used to further cause harm, if not put out correctly, if not thinking correctly. We also saw that we've got 4 media houses in South Africa, the main media houses. Within that media houses, they've retrenched up to 4,000 journalists over the last 5 years. These were all senior journalists, because most of these media houses now are about profits and shares. It's not about giving us information, it's about making money. And you find that these journalists are all senior journalists. They're in their mid-40s upwards, that has been retrenched, from photojournalists to investigative journalists. And what you now see is the media, very media houses, you'll see November, they will advertise in all the newspapers. Are you newly graduate journalism student, communication student? Would you like to do an internship for the next year with Media 24, with Independent? The graduates then get taken in, but these graduates are taken in as interns. First and foremost, they're being paid a pittance. Secondly, there's no coaching and mentoring. They get put into a room, they have to produce stories. We're one institution that gets inundated. If a story breaks today, we will have more than 10 journalists phoning us just from the SABC, asking us who they can interview for a particular story. And that is why I'm saying many times you can read all the dailies, you can watch, I'll say 3 news channels, and you will still be asking yourself a question, do I know what the story is about? So when I say we work with journalists, it's to always make sure they think, why am I writing this? For who am I writing it? What change do I want to effect? So you find though you have to prod them, you have to get them to do that. At the same time too, you look at a journalist will write a story, 3,000 words. But in the space that gets given is for 500 or 1,000 words. So you can encourage them to stick, to be concise. Tell me what you want to tell me and tell me quick and tell me in the first 5 seconds. Don't write 10 pages and then give it to me. Because if you leave the power up to the sub-editors, they will change the heading and they will edit your story, and when you read your own story, you won't recognize it. You won't even know what your story is saying. So we try and encourage them to be concise. We try and teach them to vary their sources and to look at the credibility of their sources. You also try, what we also do is we have open house events, and that is mainly for journalists to be exposed to resource people at all the time. Because we no longer have beat reporters. You know, before journalists specialized in health, they specialized in education, they specialized in science. Now you, after your 4-year studies at university, you are expected to write on all issues, every issue that gets thrown at you. And your deadline is tight, and most of the time you don't have a budget to leave your desk. That's the reality that most journalists find themselves in. Yes, we have excellent genre of journalists, and Amabungani, Mail and Guardian, and there's pockets of excellence around, but you will find that those journalists themselves, they don't stop working. They're doing research continuously, and they've got the ethics of working in their own time, so they don't knock off. Also, we need to ask ourselves a question when we work with people, and those are the kind of questions we pose. Have you become a journalist, just like have you become a school teacher because you have the passion for it, because you think it's sexy? So I think many years ago, a lot of people specialized in certain fields because they had the passion for it. They were very clear what they're going to change. If I become an educator, the power I have to mold a mind and the kind of leaders I want to create. If I'm going to be a journalist, the power I have of what the information I'm going to put out and how I will follow up on that story. So today you will read a story that's really breaking and interesting. And I will look for that story for the next 3 months and not see that story. And then once I've forgotten completely about the story, I then see a follow-up story. This is the reality that we see within our media. So we have the challenges all the time. If we're still relevant, we're 26 years in existence. Are we still making a difference? Should our training program look, what should it look like? Should we still be doing print, or what should we be doing? So more and more we find ourselves moving on to digital training, social media, but now we also have to look at what instruments are available to journalists, cost of data. Do we need to run a campaign against the cost of data? As South Africans and as South Africa, we know that we're one of the few countries on the continent where our data is the highest. So millions of people have access to internet in the workplace. When they're not at the workplace, they don't have access. So this is the reality that we're dealing with. And I think when we talk to journalists, we want them to understand that. We do a lot of work with community media journalists, for example, radio. And we see that, we've always seen radio journalists, it's volunteers, unemployed young people, coming in volunteering, gaining access to a platform that gives them the space to gain access to training institutions. And we also try and guide them, what is your own personal goals? Where do you want to see yourself beyond this?
Thank you. Thanks. I'd love to talk more about community media, because I think that that's really a space where, you know, as social accountability practitioners, it's a way to kind of tap into citizens at a local level. But I want to go to Karabo and ask you, we tend to blame technology, you know, for issues of fake news and misinformation. But do you think the media and journalists are doing enough to push back against, you know, the levels of misinformation that we're getting? And what role can civil society play in working with the media to push back against that information and kind of draw back some of the credibility that we are questioning about the media today?
Sure. Yeah. There was a study, I'm trying to remember who did it, but it will come to mind. But it was looking at the phenomenon of misinformation. I prefer misinformation to fake news. Misinformation online, and it was a comprehensive study done across various platforms, and the finding was that credible information gets a head start on social media, but ultimately it's the misinformation, the fake news, which gains traction, because people generally find the fake news, the salacious content more exciting, and so it's more prone to being spread widely on social media platforms. And so even when there is credible information which is being shared online on various digital platforms, it seems as if misinformation gains traction much faster. What can journalists do? I'll talk about what we do at Amabongane, and I think there's been quite a depressing state of media which has been given, and I want to talk about our model simply because it presents an alternative. And to start off by saying there's an analogy which I don't necessarily like, but I think it's useful as a description, which says that the role of a journalist is to say, if one person says to you it's raining outside, another person says to you it's not raining outside, the journalist should go and look out the window to confirm what exactly is happening. And I think that speaks to what journalists, or at least what we call ourselves at Amabongane, which is accountability journalism, have got a responsibility to do. To say, these are the various narratives, information, which are being given to us. We need to then investigate whether or not whatever is being presented is actually truthful information. Now, we're able to do that not necessarily, or not only because we have a strong adherence to ethical journalism, but because the model itself is sheltered from many of the pressures that other media face. And so we are non-profit media, and so we partially donor funded, which is 70% of our overall costs. And then when we left the Mail and Guardian, we were previously the Mail and Guardian's investigative center, investigative unit, we had to make a tough decision about what we're going to do to make up the shortfall. So the Mail and Guardian was contributing 30% of our costs for the content which we gave to them exclusively. And the choice was either we're going to go independent, and when we do publish with other media companies, so commercial media, we will charge them for sort of like a kind of freelancing, but we'll charge them for the content that we are giving them. But because we understood that South Africa is in a time when there's a much greater need for investigative journalism as a public good, we wanted to shelter ourselves from the difficulties which come from having a monetized relationship with other media companies. And so we took the decision to say, we are not going to sell our content to other publishing partners. We're going to continue to produce and then offer our content at no cost. And there are two reasons for that. We wanted to keep our content outside of any paywall, because we wanted to ensure that the public could access it without being limited by costs. But secondly, to ensure that we weren't limited by the demands of a paying partner. And so we had to then say, well, the only way to supplement our 30% of our costs is to ask the public to support us. Now, it's new territory. We know that in the US and in other countries it's worked relatively successful around the crowdfunding model. With The Guardian, they've been trying to do it for some time as well, with a moderate level of success as well. But it was the first time, I think, in South Africa that an investigative centre had decided to go this route. It was it was in 2016, and it was a trying time because it was conversations within our team, such as, we'll cut our salaries, we are going to make this work, because we're so passionate about ensuring that the content had integrity as much as possible. So we put together, very much on our own, put together a little crowdfunding model to say, please fund us. We want to be able to do this work. And it's been really encouraging and phenomenally successful to see that our tiny sort of crowdfunding campaign has been able to not only cover the 30% shortfall following our departure from the Mail and Guardian, but exceed that. And so now through Give and Gain, for the South Africans in the room, through Give and Gain, we've been able to raise 1.9 million, which is a phenomenal amount. And I think that speaks to South Africans and those who live here really wanting to support good investigative journalism. What we also do, I think, to counter the mistrust in journalism and investigative journalism is actually very transparent about our practice. And so if you read our very long investigative pieces, which we publish through other media companies as well as our own website, we're very determined to show what went into putting together the piece. And so yes, there are obviously, and to keep sources safe, there are anonymous sources, but we corroborate that with documentation. And this is where having information becomes so crucial to journalism. And so it's not sufficient for our reporters to merely go on, a source told me that this happened, but it's saying, and I think this is just a general journalism ethic principle, of a source may tell you that this is what's happening within the ruling party, or this is what's happening in a particular business, or as you saw with the Gupta leaks, this is what's happening with a professional services company, be it Trillion or... So, sorry, for the non-South Africans in the room, one of the big stories that investigative journalists, and not just us, but investigative journalists in South Africa have covered has been around state capture and a particular family called the Guptas. And although we worked with confidential sources in that, a lot of it also relied on doing other digging work, and so getting source documentation. And as much as possible, we make all of that source documentation available on our website. And so we say to our readers, to other journalists, we'll put, so what you, if you go to our website now, we've got something called an evidence docket, and all of the financial statements, the correspondence, the any other documentation which corroborates what we are saying in our reporting is available freely to anybody who wants to scrutinize that. And it's had an impact, I think, for other journalists being able to say, well, let me go and get these resources to do further investigative work or further reporting. But it's also become an interesting accountability tool, where in one instance, there's been a case which I think has just recently been launched, and that was based off our evidence docket. So somebody took the information, the evidence docket, said, this proves that malfeasance took place, and therefore I'm going to push for prosecution. And I think if we are going to counter misinformation as media or as investigative journalism, there's an accountability to build trust amongst our audiences. And that trust is built not simply by saying, we are investigative journalism, we are doing our work, but it's by saying, here's how we do our work, bringing our readers, our audiences, those who both love and hate us, into our confidence to say, even if you do not like what we are doing, at least we can agree that the facts which are being put on the table are correct.
Great, thanks. And I think that it's a really interesting model, and we see it in other organizations in South Africa. I think the Daily Maverick, for example, has also got an independent funding source, and it's interesting to think about, you know, in that kind of context, you're able to do the kind of work that you do, but, you know, where are the challenges for journalists who work, for example, in state broadcasters, or public broadcasters, or commercial media? I'm going to open the floor, I think, to more challenging questions from the floor. So if we can take a round of questions, and yeah, any questions? So we've got one hand here. Any others? Two, Demi? Okay, we'll take those two for now. Zuki had a hand. Zuki.
Morning. Thank you so much. I think that was quite an eye-opening session or discussion, and I think, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why this particular panel for me is quite apt and timely. And I think there was a lot in it, so I'll really just pick on two issues, primarily those that I think, so a few steps back. I'm very interested in the context of sources of information and people who provide that, and we've spoken quite a bit in the last day and a half about trust. You know, we're talking about trust between, you know, the public servants and communities or citizens or members of the public. In this context, I'm very curious to know how trust is created between media practitioners, journalists, be it community journalists, investigative journalists, and sources. So who do you trust? Why do you trust them? That's the first question, and it does link to something, you know, Jimmy said that was interesting to me about whistleblowers. And their role in that system, and who is a whistleblower, how do you trust them, and all of those questions. So I think that's really to everyone. The second is one that relates to, so I love what Karaba said about salacious content, and what people are prone to kind of spread, or what people are drawn to. And my question is about this notion of social accountability, or the various elements of social accountability. what drives a story in that context. So service delivery is big, and it's it's a really important context. Social justice is big and really important. But there are some very dry issues that we work with. There are some very dry topics, but that are fundamental to social justice. So what are the kinds of things that help journalists drive those topics? So we, in our program, are very, often will share information or share content. And often it's just the sense of this is just really difficult to build into something that the public want to engage with. But it is important within the social accountability system, and so that's a long-winded question, a long-winded way of asking, how do you bridge the gap between the really juicy, salacious stuff, and maybe I shouldn't be saying salacious, and the important, life-serving, but not so juicy stuff.
Okay, so I think the first question was around sources and trust. So maybe Faisal, you want to speak to maybe how do you train journalists to be, I suppose, aware and wary of how they verify sources and that kind of things, and then maybe the others can speak more to the processes of doing that.
I think within all our training courses, whether it's creative writing, whether it's fact-checking, there are sessions where journalists are taught how to source. You'll take a newspaper, you'll read the story, and you'll show them, okay, so this is what Karabo's writing about here. So where do Karabo find this information? How will we start looking at? So she interviewed Mr. Paul. Where does Paul live? What does Paul do? Why would Paul have access to the story? Because that's where it starts, isn't it, in the community? Someone says something, and then we write about it. But then we work and we look at, okay, let's go and check this. Is the person really Paul? Does Paul work at this company? Did this happen in the kitchen? I'm just taking that a very late-term story. But at the same time, do we look at, you check your sources, you make the time, you try and find additional sources. You don't just take one source as a verification. You go and verify. So you teach them the tools. For example, there's a lot of data available. There's a lot of companies. GRI is International Global Resource Institute. There's another organization, Africa something. But what they do is they put annual journals out on every sector that you can think in the world. Agriculture, climate change, economic reporting, but these are thick journals like this. So what you find is the important thing was to train journalists in reading an Excel spreadsheet. You show them how to use it, you show them how they take that, how they access the available data, how they analyze it to inform their stories better. There's a lot of data available, but you then identify what skills is missing in journalists. You look at the quality of the story and you will see that they don't know how to read the Excel spreadsheet, or they don't know how fast to take the data that's available and quantify it to give background information to their story. That we realized about 2-3 years ago only. There were all these journals available. There's a lot of research being done at universities. UNISA does a stack, I think Rhodes does a stack, but journalists, they access it, but they don't know how to quantify and summarize it like this. So one of our journalists, one of our facilitators, in fact, Graham Addison, came up with the idea to say we need to train journalists in every training that takes place on a day on how to read a spreadsheet, how to access this data, and how to analyze this data to benefit and update their story. That's but one way of doing it.
Jimmy, do you want to talk a bit about developing that relation of trust with sources? And then Karabo, can I ask you to come to Zuki's second point, which was, I think, about framing. So how do we frame particular stories that are important, but might not be, thrilling to read? How do we make them important to people?
All right. I'll begin by adding a little bit of what perhaps I didn't initially add in terms of what we do as ACA, and I'm glad that we've had a point here raised about sources and about investigative journalism and the work around that and how you cultivate trust with your sources. I think that as journalists, we are, and as social accountability actors, we must be people that are absolutely dedicated and devoted to our ethics. So sources we have found, Vanessa, is that they are willing to give information. And there are a lot of sources in government departments, as long as you stick to your end of the bargain. If they do not want to be identified, then you must stick to that, which is perhaps in some ways they would amount, okay, as you asked, to whistleblowers. So they come to you with information, certain bits and pieces. But as a good journalism training outfit, as we believe ourselves to be, you must be able to verify and collaborate that information with other sources, and also to try and find if that information does exist in terms of official documentation. I'll give a point of departure that was for us as SEA. There was a huge story in the country about the government purchasing 42 fire tenders, which are now famously known as wheelbarrows, because the former minister referred to them as such. The information was that they were bought for $1 million each. And so there were these arguments back and forth as to whether that equipment was actually worth that much. And the media landscape was full of stories about what this politician said and what this other one said. So within our organization, we have a fact-checking unit. So we decided to put out information that we could verify without having human sources cited. And we put out that information and made very bold claims. So we said this was theft. We believe that there was stealing of public resources. We also put it out to you that these fire tenders were never bought by Zambia. We also said these fire tenders are not what they are said to be. We can tell you that these fire tenders came to Zambia through Namibia. They were not made by Scania, even though they are branded by Scania. So we put out all these claims. And then there was this attack.
has retired now, and the new person for South Africa is Latifa Mumbara. But what you find is that they do respond quite effectively. They get your complaint from anyone. They do their own follow-up, and they also publicly put the results on their website after they've sent the response back to the media houses.
Great. Question on the side?
Right, thank you. Allow me to thank the panel for that very useful information that you're sharing with us. My question is around media capture. How are we able to deal with that? I mean, we have a situation where some powerful individuals or institutions are able to pay the media to kill a story. We have certain individuals that can even pay them to manufacture a story. How do we deal with that? I've asked that question on several platforms, and I've been told we need to stick to our ethos. We've got these ethics as media, but then, yeah, you have those ethos, but then people don't follow. So what happens in this instance where, in a case like Zambia, you have the ruling party, which has employed some chronic liars as their media directors? Like, really, I think Jimmy understands what I'm talking about. You've got these media directors for the Patriotic Front government, and these guys are like serious chronic liars. And whenever they call for a press conference, the media will be swarming around them like bees, and they're feeding the country hogwash that these are not facts. When you look at certain reports, things that have been researched, there's evidence to that effect. And they're telling you something totally different. So you have a situation where journalism has become commercialized. People go there because they're going to be given some money, they're going to, they're looking to be given some jobs somewhere, and there's been that level of media capture. How do we deal with that such that the people are informed, objectively informed, for them to make informed decisions? As media practitioners, well, it's not targeted at any one of you, but like you could just pick it up.
Okay, so I think that that's an important question around media capture, but also how do we instill media literacy in citizens so that they are able to decipher, where is the reliable, trustworthy information that they're receiving from the media as well. I don't know who wants to measure up to.
All right, I'll go first, and I fully understand where Wesley is coming from, and so Wesley, you've spoken about media being captured, being paid to kill a story or to manufacture a story. There's even a third dimension to that, which is to kill a media career. So institutions, at least in Zambia, I know for a fact, are being paid to lay off certain journalists because they're asking too much, or they are not towing the line, so to speak. And I think that the answer is partly in what Vanessa has said. One of the ways that we are going to sustain good media is by making the public understand what constitutes good media. And so the question then is, how do we do that? I think that as civil society actors, but not only as civil society actors, we need to begin to extend this influence or this understanding that we have of what good media is to other sectors that we have influence, people that we can influence, both in our, to pick from yesterday's terms, both in our formal and informal settings. So you are executive director in a CSO, as executive directors in CSOs, you can begin to engage with executive directors of professional bodies, the Law Association, and all these individuals to begin to rally around good media. Because the fact is that good media still does exist. And we have made a decision, for instance, as ACA. Our primary media that we work with is community media. And our reason for choosing community media, community radio stations in particular, is that they are very difficult to be co-opted politically, though it has happened. And we've had to drop some radio stations. But it doesn't happen at the same level as it does with commercial media. Commercial media in Zambia is very prone to political co-opting because, one, it is not commercially strong. So either opposition or political parties can, or the ruling party can offer monetary incentives to radio stations that are mostly husband and wife entities, or brother and sister, brother and brother entities. When you look at the ownership of commercial media in Zambia, usually those are the structures, or former workmates. So Wesley and I work together for this newspaper. We've opened our own outfit, or we've opened our own radio station. That is the first kind of ownership. The second one is husband and wife, or husband or man and partner, woman and partner. But then community radio by law is owned by the community, so you have to vote for a chairman every 3 years. You've got a board that hires the management team and oversees the management team. So there is a much higher level of independence in the community media. Although the political big hitters have now begun to go for the entire board because they've got the financial muscle to do so. So there is a radio station in the Eastern Province where they've simply gone and captured the entire board, empowered them financially, inverted commas. And so they are now beginning to tour a particular line. We dropped them first. BBC Media Action have also dropped them. And so when you do that as civil society, the community knows. Political party players, where the difference is, they are not going to stay with the radio station for the long haul, while civil society can. We have 3, 4, 5-year contracts with them. The political party just pays them once off and goes. And when that happens, then that media house becomes exposed, and the public around them knows that these have been sold out. But then that is just one of the ways, Wesley. It's much more complex than that. But that, in my opinion, could be one of the ways we begin to stand and rally around good media. Make the public know what constitutes a good story, what does it mean to have a story that is balanced, what does it mean to have sources that are credible, what do media ethics demand. We need to begin to put out statements that, partly answering your question, that actually attack bad journalism. So don't go for the person, but go for the piece itself and say, this piece is unfair. Why was the counter opinion not added? Why was this not done? Why was this not done? So we as TI demand that this media house balances this story for the public to have a fair understanding of what is obtaining here. And by doing so, we are calling out the media, but we're not being too directly attacking them. And by default, we are educating the public on how stories should look.
Yeah, I mean, we've had capture of the media in South Africa, and I want to focus on the capture of our public broadcasting, public broadcaster, the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And I think first is to understand why capture of the media is something that happens, and I think it's because it's such a powerful instrument, and it's because our political leadership want to control the flow of information, because that ultimately will determine the state of our democracy. With the